Hello musicians, happy Halloween. It is October 31st. It is my wife's favorite holiday of the year, hence the attempt to join in and have part of the fun. Tonight we go out with little baby Julian trick-or-treating for the first time, and I'm looking forward to it. It did make me think, Halloween, scary movies. I don't know if you've got Netflix or whatever your streaming program is, all of the horror movies are sort of suggested. I'm not really into horror movies myself. But it made me wonder, has music ever made you feel fear? For me, I couldn't think of any instances where that was the case. It was only if I had it in the context of a movie, so the Jaws theme or a surprise, what were they called? Jump scares in a horror movie or something like that. But I don't think music has ever made me feel the emotion of fear. I've had nostalgia for sure, joy and energy, maybe even sadness and melancholy, but never fear. So I wonder, perhaps you could share if you've had an experience just with music, no other media, if you've experienced fear. I can imagine what some of the answers might be. Yes, I had to play in front of people. I had to sight read, that might induce fear. But I'm thinking more about music that would, from you hearing it, make you feel afraid. I couldn't think of an example for myself. But it does bring me onto an interesting topic that came up in some of the coaching calls I've been giving recently at CGC. And that is the idea of story. So I mentioned that fear can be part of the musical experience, often if it's in a movie. And one of the ways that I've been helping people embrace their musicality and their curiosity and their imagination in music is that sometimes we can get very ensconced in the score and maybe a little bit overwhelmed by all the instructions. We've got pitch, we've got rhythm, we've got expression, dynamics, articulation. We've got all the fingerings, glissando, portamento, all of these instructions, and then sometimes even more detailed written out ones in 20th and 21st century scores, like, sometimes as abstract as a dash of yellow, or with emotions, it's really so much instruction. I find as a teacher and sometimes as a player that I can get around all of this overwhelm quite quickly if you start engaging in story and imagination. Now, a great teacher who I worked with many years ago who really capitalized on this was Oscar Gilia. And if you know anyone who studied with him in the Siena masterclass, which runs for a summer in Italy, hard work, I know, but it was a privilege to be there. But he really told a lot of stories. He often framed his musical suggestions through story, and he was a great storyteller and also a polyglot. He would tell these stories in different languages. But they really stay with you, these stories. So one thing I try to do with students is start with the imagination with a piece, or even with a piece you already play, instead of playing it correctly with the right fingering, with the right articulation, maybe play it in different scenarios. So if we were just to take a scale, for example, if we remove all of the self-criticism of, am I alternating? Is my sound okay? Is it in time? Did I make a mistake? Etc., etc. And now go, okay, C major. C major, it's sunrise, there's little birds flying around the tree. Now, whether you agree that's a musical representation of what I just said is a little bit irrelevant. The point is that I had an idea and I translated it through the music, and it resulted in a number of different techniques being used, but I wasn't thinking about the techniques. So here is now an elephant stomping through C major scale. Right? I instinctively used my thumb. I used a loud dynamic. I used a bit of staccato, but I didn't really think about all of these things. So this is a challenge for you to experiment with approaching music imagination first, curiosity first, creativity first, and seeing where that might get you. I think, a question that does come up quite often in all guitar and music education, I'm sure, is, should I learn the notes first and get them in my fingers and then work on the musicality, or include the musicality from the beginning? And my answer is always include musicality from the beginning, because if you learn the mechanical movements and memorize the piece, which is often the case if you just repeat passages over and over again, one, you are imbuing that interpretation in your fingers with just sort of a musically devoid of musicality, right? You're focused on the movements, not any dynamics or articulations or anything to communicate. And so when you go and try and put it back in, your fingers have learned that way of moving, especially if you've gotten to the point of memorization. So even though you're trying to do musical shaping and phrasing, your fingers will kind of fight back against you because they're so used to moving the way they've learned the piece. So in a way, you become quite inflexible. Now, this is a whole nother conversation about memorization, but that's for another video. But what I'm suggesting is, yes, integrate musical ideas from the very beginning. But you're a beginner, you're an intermediate player. How do you do that? That's maybe something that seems too sophisticated. Well, this, coming up with the idea first, the creative idea. I like to say put on the conductor's hat or even a teacher's hat and think about how you want the music to sound. If you're not familiar enough with notation or tab or the score where you can sort of get an idea from just looking at the score, you could use other people's recordings and start being thoughtful about, well, I like that, I'd do that, or I wouldn't do that, or I would do more of that. That's kind of like the teacher hat. Or if you can have a concept of a piece, perhaps you're familiar with it already, you can listen to a recording and almost say, I want you to do more of that. Bring out this line, bigger crescendo here. So now you're starting to remove the barrier of the instrument and your fingers and get straight to your innate musicality. And you have spent probably a lifetime surrounded by Western music. If you're listening to this video, it's highly likely. Plenty of exceptions, I'm sure, but you've listened to a lot of music. You've maybe even played a lot of music. You actually have a huge wealth of understanding of how music can be expressive and how it goes. And this helps tap into that. Now, I thought as a fun little thing, here we go, take a piece, for example. So this is Allegretto by Ferdinando Carulli, and it is in the Easy Classical Guitar Volume 1, available freely at CGC. Here's what the first section, the first 8 measures would sound like. Okay, so very standard, probably ticking boxes about legato and a bit of phrasing and things like that. Great, fine. Now, the idea here is to put a story, a scenario, an imagery into this piece. Okay, so being Halloween, hence the pumpkin, let's make this spooky. Maybe. I'm probably drawing, how can music be spooky? I'm really just drawing upon references perhaps to other pieces that are associated with Halloween. That's fine. That's what we do as a culture. That's what I mean about we've been living in this Western music culture and we have a lot of innate shared language, musical language, even if we're beginner guitarists. And then we could do... And there's just so much more color and interest in that just from coming up with the idea. In a way, it's kind of liberating. We get away from, am I playing this correctly? Can I get a tick? Can I get a mark for this on the exam? We go from that to the creative space, which we all have, but we probably are a bit distanced from since when we were a child. And then we can get more sophisticated with fingerings and articulations and all sorts of things. But the point is that this is a really nice technique to get around our roadblock of musicality and injecting that. So, and then you could now think of it as a barcarolle, right? So I just recently heard someone play Julia Florida, 6/8, more of a rocking feel. Maybe. I wasn't really sold on that, but it's interesting how it immediately elicits a very different interpretation. The idea of story accompanying music goes back to this split. In the first Viennese school, we had Beethoven was the figure, the behemoth of Western classical music. And after he died, there was kind of a forking of opinion as to what music is and what it could be. Because one of the last works that Beethoven offered the world is his Ninth Symphony, which uses poetry from Schiller, the Ode to Joy, uses choir, orchestra, and don't forget also his Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, had elements of, like, this is the cuckoo bird. It had sort of elements that elicited imagery. And so one school of thought, which was Wolf and Liszt and Wagner, which is the important one, went down this path of music having story and meaning and programmatic music. That's where you get tone poems from in the early 19th century, where there's a whole story that goes along with music. And when you think about music of John Williams in the movies, like Harry Potter, Jaws, Jurassic Park, that really ties back to Wagner, where he created the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is this complete artwork where you had opera, poetry, music. The music was sunken for the first time with those operas. So it seemed like the music was emanating out of nowhere, which is just like movies. We have movies, we see the imagery, we have the dialogue, and we have music enhancing the emotional landscape of that. So that's programmatic music, where people believe that, music and lyrics and words could enhance one another and create something greater. The other school of thought went with Brahms, which was much more of a pure music, which music doesn't mean anything specifically. It just is music. And so that's, Brahms was the big advocate of that pathway with his symphonies and sonatas, and, that it didn't have story attached to it. So what I'm suggesting is very much along the lines of story. Not so much because I think one is correct, better. It's really just that it works. So I encourage you to give it a go. Take a piece that you know and then come up with some contrasting ideas. Halloween, may as well, it's Halloween. Butterflies, light and airy and fairy, scary, happy, sad, melancholy, silly, jazzy. Anything that triggers a little bit of an imagination spark, and then run with it. You are not going to receive letters from lawyers of Carulli or Carcassi or Saw. You have the freedom to play around and explore with that. And play is what we like to do with music. So enjoy. I'd love to hear your opinions of this approach. Perhaps it's been useful to you. Perhaps there are teachers out there that use something similar. Love to hear from you in the comments below. Take care, everyone, and happy Halloween.